On the 4th of July each year, millions of Americans across 50 states gather for fireworks, parades, and huge celebrations. It's the day that the United States marks its birth as an independent nation, the moment when 13 British colonies broke away from the British Empire and began forging a new country. But what if this is the wrong date? History shows us that the vote for independence didn't actually happen on the 4th of July. It happened 2 days earlier. So why has one date become America's national birthday, while the other often goes without notice? And how has a single document become so powerful that 250 years later, politicians, activists, and presidents are still arguing over what it really means? Before we get into the story, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you don't miss anything from History Extra. On the 2nd of July 1776, delegates from across the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia and voted to sever their ties with Britain. For many of those present, this was the decisive moment. In fact, one of the leading revolutionaries and future president, John Adams, was convinced that Americans would celebrate the 2nd of July forever. I spoke to Professor Adam Smith for a 4-part podcast series on the Revolutionary War, and this is what he told me.
After the Congress had voted for independence on the 2nd of July, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail back home in near Boston, and he said in this letter, "The 2nd day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the Day of Deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." That's a very extravagant, enthusiastic letter from John Adams, who is usually much more restrained than that. You can tell how excited he was and how convinced he was that this act of independency, which, as he had already said, had been, as he understood it, initiated from London, that this act of independency of the 2nd of July would be the nation's true birthday. And in fact, of course, it was the press release 2 days later, the Declaration of Independence explaining and justifying that separation, which has become the nation's birthday.
As we now know, Adams's prediction about the celebrations was wrong. While the vote by Congress on the 2nd had created independence, it was the Declaration that explained it. And as Professor Smith put it, the Declaration was merely the revolution's press release. So why was the document so necessary? From today's point in history, it's easy to imagine independence as inevitable. But for much of the conflict, that wasn't the case. As I heard from Professor Smith, though many colonists had been airing grievances from as early as the mid-1760s, they initially weren't demanding a separate nation. They wanted what they believed were their traditional rights as British subjects. Flashpoint taxes like the Stamp Act of 1765 and the 1773 Tea Act caused moments of discontent in the colonies that translated into intercolonial organisation. You can find out more in another of our videos, which shows how, in reaction to the Boston Tea Party, there was a crackdown of British authority that curtailed freedom, particularly in New England. Tensions continued to grow, and by the time the first shot was fired at the Battle of Lexington in April 1775, communications were extremely frayed and beginning to indicate that a separation might be on the cards. But it wasn't a definitive move for independence even then, and we certainly shouldn't think of the Declaration as a single lightning strike moment. Historian George Goodwin wrote for HistoryExtra magazine that the Declaration was initially the product of the misunderstandings, escalating tensions, and missed opportunities within the deteriorating relationship between the Kingdom of Great Britain and its American colonies. Adam Smith told me that a historian called Pauline Meyer has found at least 90 local declarations of independence that were passed and written and ratified in local towns and communities. These show the groundswell of sentiment that the July 1776 Declaration was drawing on. Even the sentiments expressed in the eventual document by the Committee of 5 authors belied a relatively swift shift in attitude. Goodwin highlights that as of 1774, Thomas Jefferson, one of the key authors of the Declaration, wrote in his work A Summary View of the Rights of British America that it is neither our wish nor our interest to separate from Great Britain. And he enunciated the view that the monarch was passively failing his American subjects. But by the time of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson had decided that King George had now taken the most active of roles and should be judged accordingly. In other words, the Declaration clearly laid out who to blame. The eventual document was a carefully constructed case explaining why the colonies believed they had the right to break away. And that's an important point to help us understand why this document has such an important legacy. The Declaration's central claim drew heavily on Enlightenment thinking and the work of a philosopher called John Locke. It argued that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. And when governments violate people's rights, those people have the right to alter or abolish them. This idea, that authority relies on the consent of the governed, is an important reason why the Declaration matters so much today, and why its impact didn't stay in 1776, spreading far beyond the American Revolution. George Goodwin notes that it later became the forerunner and inspiration of around 120 political declarations across the world. But even without the global legacy, the Declaration's greatest impact may have been inside the United States, because almost immediately people started asking a crucial question. If all men are created equal, as the Declaration puts it, who exactly counts? Its authors included slaveholders, and the document contained deep contradictions. It spoke of liberty while slavery remained entrenched, and proclaimed equality while excluding women, Indigenous peoples, and many others from political life. Its words have since become powerful tools for people seeking change. Here's what Professor Adam Smith said.
The really important thing here is that the intentions of the framers, which are often invoked and discussed in American politics, really don't necessarily have very much to do with the way in which the document is later interpreted. Most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, certainly, of course, including Thomas Jefferson, were slaveholders. Clearly, when Jefferson wrote the phrase, all men are created equal, he did not mean that enslaved people were equal to him and his chums. That clearly wasn't what he meant. There's a whole long, complicated and interesting story of Jefferson's somewhat ambiguous relationship to slavery, but it's pretty clear that he didn't actually mean the equality of the races. But immediately after the Declaration of Independence was signed and circulated and read aloud, enslaved people started using that language in order to advocate for their own freedom. It didn't take a generation, it didn't even take a decade for oppressed groups within the American colonies, or the American states, as we should perhaps now start calling them in this discussion. It was immediate before oppressed groups started saying, and what about us? If this is the claim, this is inspiring language, and what about us? We want to make that a reality.
So it's something it's there to inspire, but it's something that's also to push against immediately.
Yes, I mean there are cases in Massachusetts where enslaved people take to court a case for their own freedom directly using the language of the Declaration of Independence. So this becomes a document that within a year or two of its signing becomes, in some cases, of practical legal use to enslaved people and others to advocate for their own emancipation.
So a document that looms large still today, 250 years on.
Oh, certainly. I mean, it's that much of the American political tradition is based on an invocation of that idea. And one, thinks about the great abolitionists of the 19th century, of Abraham Lincoln, of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King. And the Declaration of Independence is kind of sewn into the American imaginary. I mean, Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War is an important part of this story. The Declaration of Independence changed its meaning around the time of the great crisis over slavery in the 1860s and became probably even more central to American political culture from that moment onwards. But as I'm saying, it was certainly, definitely a powerful idea that was circulating as early as the late 1770s.
So, has America been celebrating Independence Day on the wrong date? Technically, perhaps. Remember, the vote did happen on the 2nd, meaning that the decision for independence was already made. But the 4th of July has survived as an emblem because it's so strongly attached to the story that America has chosen to tell about its independence. One which is built around a document that, as you've heard, continues to shape debates about freedom, equality, and citizenship. What does it mean to you? Let us know in the comments. And head to the HistoryExtra app for a lot more content about the Declaration, the Revolutionary War, and its global legacy 250 years later.